PodCastle, episode 812 for Tuesday the 7th of November 2023. No Mercy to the Rest by Bennett North, read by C.L. Clarke and produced by Devin Martin. Rated PG-13 for super villainous violence and attempts to raise the dead. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to PodCastle, the flying castle of fantasy fiction. I'm your host, Matt Dovey, and it is my privilege to present another 15th anniversary special episode for you. This week we have erstwhile co-editor C.L. Clarke returning to us for an interview, and the story they've selected to rerun is No Mercy to the Rest by Bennett North, narrated by Sheree themselves. This episode was a PodCastle original when it originally ran as episode 604. Bennett North is a technomage, artist and rock climbing enthusiast whose work has appeared in F&SF, Escape Pod and Beneath Ceaseless Skies. Sheree Clarke graduated from Indiana University's Creative Writing MFA. They've been a personal trainer, an English teacher and an editor, here of course, and is some combination thereof as they travel the world. When they're not writing or working, they're learning languages, doing P90 something, or reading about war and post-colonial history. Their debut novel, The Unbroken, came out with Orbit in 2021, and the follow-up, The Faithless, was released this April for all your anguished, star-crossed sapphic needs. Their work has also appeared in Fire and Uncanny, and they won the 2021 Ignites for Best Short Story with You Perfect Broken Thing. And now pay attention, for our tale is about to begin, and the lines have shifted since you last came to town.
No Mercy to the Rest by Bennett North. Read for you by C.L. Clarke. Sadie parked in the lee of Castle Inferno, where she would be spared from the wind, and sat while the engine ticked, trying to convince herself to let go of the steering wheel. The castle stood stark against the sky, dark stone walls leaching the saturation from the blue. One tower was burned out and soot-streaked, no sign of repair. Was Dr. Inferno hard up for cash, or did fresh tarmac interfere with the mad scientist aesthetic? Sadie grabbed the swinging St. Christopher medal from the rearview mirror and squeezed it. "Keep an eye on me, Gemma," she said. "This is for you." The stairs that hugged the foundation ended at a pair of wooden doors set into a stone arch that had to be 30 feet tall. Sadie ducked into the corner of the arch, out of the wind, and pressed the plastic doorbell button. Something heavy thunked inside, then one of the doors opened enough for a woman to lean out. She was white, with frizzy, graying hair, a Red Sox t-shirt, and jeans. "Sadie Jones?" the woman asked, looking her up and down. "That's me," said Sadie. "I'm looking for an Igor?" "You found her." The woman opened the door another few inches. "Come on. If the wind catches this door, it's impossible to close." Sadie squeezed through the opening into a dark, echoing foyer. Igor forced the door closed, while Sadie looked around. The floor was smooth stone, worn down under 1,000 years of footfalls. Arched doors led left and right, and a helical staircase rose up ahead. In one corner, a Wi-Fi range extender blinked green. "So, right, hello. I'm Igor and this is Castle Inferno." She led Sadie through the left archway to a staircase leading down. "I'm so glad you could make it. Would you like coffee before we start? Tea? Water?" "No, thanks." This wasn't what Sadie had expected. She hadn't really known what to expect. More of a background check, certainly. Perhaps armed guards or dogs. Barbed wire fences, at least. So far, she'd only seen one killer robot, and that was down at the entrance to the road up the mountain. She wasn't even convinced that that one was anything but decorative. The stairs descended farther down than the level of the parking lot. They debouched into a round, tile-paved room with scorch-stained sconces on the walls. The room had been modernized with fluorescent lights, a floor drain, and metal countertops. Not quite the standard Sadie was used to, but she could make do. 2 crates on a counter held chickens, clucking softly. A gurney in the middle of the room held a corpse. Sadie stopped at the foot of the stairs. "We're not interested in your recommendations," Igor said. She indicated the corpse without looking at it. "We only care if you can raise the dead. I have to admit, I thought you'd be—" Igor trailed off. "Whiter?" Sadie said, before she could help herself. Igor's eyebrows flicked upward in surprise for a second. "Older. I'm older than I look." Sadie crossed to the corpse. She wasn't squeamish around the dead, but she was wary of the situation. Even supervillains get nervous around necromancers, and she didn't know what Igor expected. "So, who's this?" Igor waved a hand. "A donation. He died of natural causes, if you're wondering." She hadn't been. "Is Dr. Inferno going to meet us?" "No, he's in the middle of some experiments. You'll meet him if I decide I'm happy with your work," Igor said. "The body hasn't been embalmed, and he died 2 days ago. That's recent enough, right?" "Any time is recent enough, assuming you have what we need." Sadie cast a clinical look over the tools available. "You don't." "We have the standard reagents," Igor said. "The blood of several different animals, including humans, in the fridge. A few live chickens." She gestured at the crates. "How many people have you interviewed for this position?" Sadie asked, ignoring the chickens. Igor paused. "You're the first." "I appreciate that you gave necromancy a thorough Googling," Sadie said. "But I need more than this." "I'm willing to donate my own blood to a point," Igor said, offering a pale wrist. "How well did you know the decedent?" "I didn't." "We'd need something important to him." Sadie's gaze settled on the corpse, whose features threatened to resolve into someone more familiar. A parent, a child, a lover, even an enemy. Someone who had an impact on him, who could call his soul back from wherever it went. She caught herself and looked up, stripping the emotion from her voice. "And then we'd slaughter them and use their sacrifice to seal him back in this form. Raising the dead is not easy. I can't do it with blood and chickens." "Why would it matter if it's someone he knew?" Igor asked. "A life is a life." "That's not how magic works. That's how reality works." "Do you want me to raise the dead? Or should we talk about how it's not scientifically possible?" Sadie checked her tone. She wanted this job. It wouldn't do to antagonize people. "Without the proper sacrifice, he'll be brain dead." A muscle twitched in Igor's jaw. Her mouth settled into a line, not of anger. Disappointment? Sadness? Sadie waited. The room was silent but for the clucking of chickens. "Raise him," Igor said finally. "Without the appropriate sacrifice, I want to see how well you do with what I've provided." Sadie studied her. Not for the first time. She wondered why Dr. Inferno wanted a necromancer. "Let's do this," she said. The next morning, after receiving Igor's official job offer, Sadie put her duffel bag in the trunk and slammed it shut. All of her life fit in this car. She eyed a handful of drones whining overhead, then eased out into traffic. It would be humiliating to be bombed into smithereens by some 2-bit villain looking to make his mark, but such was life. The city was lousy with supervillains. There were the Golden Twins, who lived in an old fort on the ocean, making explosives. Professor Nostradam, who crafted unholy abominations in an alchemy lab at the university. And of course, Dr. Inferno, brooding on his mountain and sending giant robots down to menace the populace. Their battles ground the city to a halt for days, though it had been 6 months since the last big one. Sadie could name a dozen people she'd known who had died in supervillain attacks. She'd only ever tried to reanimate one. Igor met her again at the door. "Time to meet the doctor," she said grimly, as she let Sadie in. Sadie's heart leapt into her throat. "Already?" She'd taken Igor's cue and worn jeans today. Maybe she shouldn't have. She knew nothing about Dr. Inferno personally. She'd only seen his face in newspaper photos, or when he uploaded gloating videos to YouTube. Every other time had been from a distance, wearing goggles, perched in the cockpit of some death machine. He'd never seemed that laid back to Sadie, but maybe that was just his public face. Maybe he was better at separating work and home life than Sadie. They took the elevator well below where the interview had been. Sadie's ears popped. When the elevator finally stopped, it let them into a rocky hallway with electric lights strung overhead. Igor strode ahead, shoulders squared. She reached the doors at the end of the hall and hesitated for a breath before shoving them open. The room beyond was massive, its ceiling receding into shadow. To the right, banks of beeping machinery ran in long rows. To the left, pipes led from pressurized tanks. Sadie stared up at it in awe. Igor watched her, arms crossed. Her expression was brittle, like poorly made glass. "This is where the magic happens," she said. Her voice was flat, empty. "Where is he?" Igor turned and started walking again. Sadie followed, taking in her surroundings, but she stayed alert, waiting for a trap. At the end of the aisle, Igor stopped at a glass tank full of blue liquid. A body floated inside, nude, dark hair haloing his head. He was missing an arm and a leg, and his chest had been horribly burned, although the wound was bloodlessly pink, like meat from a butcher. His eyes stared at nothing. "This was how I found him after the last attack by Professor Nostradam," said Igor. "I put him in the tank. He's dead, but it's keeping him in stasis until I can fix him." Sadie stared up at the floating man, her mouth open. "Dr. Inferno's been dead for 6 months." "The tank keeps him from decomposing," Igor said defensively. "It's like he only died a few minutes ago. You said it didn't matter how long." "That's why he's been so quiet since then," Sadie said, touching the smooth, cold glass. "I never thought—" She stopped and let her hand slide off the glass. "So you want me to raise him?" Igor hugged herself, the planes of her face washed in light from the tank. "Just like he was." Sadie pressed her lips together tightly. Dr. Inferno was inches away, defenseless, as she had fantasized so many times. She could come back tonight when Igor was asleep and pull the plug, drain the tank, destroy the bastard in a way he couldn't come back from. But she hadn't taken this job to waste it on a frivolous act of revenge. "I already told you what you'll need for it," Sadie said, turning away. "Someone who was important to him. A friend, a family member." She paused. "An assistant?" Igor's brow pinched. "Or an enemy," she said. "I'm working on that." It had been an unseasonably warm November day when Gemma died. The outdoor cafes were packed, the drones flew high under the cloudless sky, and the first detonations at Professor Nostradam's lair could have been firecrackers, except for the smoke that didn't stop. Dr. Inferno's missiles pinpointed a few strategic places at the university. Professor Nostradam's alchemy lab went up first. The second missile took out the library, obliterating the records of countless experiments. The final few missiles rained down on the bunker where the professor's specimens were stored. Even the layers of poured concrete couldn't save them. Sadie had been in the dining commons and got back to the lab too late. The doors had shattered outward, singeing the papers right off the bulletin board. Inside, the roof had half buried Gemma's body. Sadie shoved the debris off her, and maybe that was what killed her. Blood loss, not blast damage. Sadie couldn't have waited. There was no time. Blood loss or blast damage, Sadie would lie awake every night for the next month wondering which it had been. But that first evening, when Gemma sprawled in a chalk circle on the floor, Sadie would repeat the ritual 2 times with increasing desperation. She had never tried to reanimate a human that mattered before. All she had to sacrifice was an abomination that Gemma worked with, and Gemma's pet beta fish. Gemma had no living parents, no best friends. Gemma's heart beat, pushing borrowed blood through her veins, but her brain refused to work her lungs, and Sadie couldn't keep her on life support forever. Sadie had nothing left to sacrifice except herself, and to her shame, she wasn't willing to go that far. Professor Nostradamus' retaliation came an hour after Sadie's last attempt with Gemma. Unlike Dr. Inferno's high-tech missiles, this was old-fashioned alchemical fire. Whatever it touched burned for weeks. A pair of dark-winged abominations flew the package up the mountain. The next day, smoke streaked the morning sky. Raising the dead takes herbs and unguents, expensive reagents. The university where Sadie had worked had an impressive endowment and liked funding quirky projects that played well in alumni newsletters and fundraising drives. She'd never have been able to afford necromancy on a postdoc salary. Igor gave her a credit card and told her the sky was the limit. The Inferno family had been old money, and all that money went to Igor if Dr. Inferno was officially declared dead. If it was his, she imagined he'd want her to use it, and if it was hers, she would use it to bring him back. "So, if this doesn't work, all his money is yours?" Sadie asked, pocketing the credit card. Igor stared at her, her eyes hollow and blue. "If this doesn't work, I don't want it." It was late spring, just past commencement, and the university campus was deserted. Sadie was depending on that. The damage had been too extensive to continue Nostradamus' program, so they'd closed for repairs while the professor took time off to regroup. But not all the reagents had been kept in the lab. Sadie let herself in by the side door. It was locked, of course, but she'd never turned in her key. That would have been too final. As long as she still had it, she could believe she might one day come back. The hallway smelled like floor polish and paint. The lights clicked on as the motion sensor caught her, illuminating the new set of double doors leading into the lab. Sadie stopped at the doors. Unlike the original set, these were rolled steel. If she inhaled, she could taste the faintest scent of ash. She pressed her hand gently against the door, then let it drop. There was a storage room down the hall. Its door yielded under her key, and she stepped into the small dark room. Plastic shelves sagged under crates of yew leaves and bottled pig fetuses. She tapped a tank of preserved eels, then opened her canvas bag and started browsing. She was digging snake skeletons out of a box, frowning over a crack in one of the skulls, when a raspy voice came from the doorway. "You're back!" The thing in the doorway was an abomination, sewn together from mismatched parts. Its eyes, both human but different colors and shapes, held unabashed delight. It was only 3 feet tall, childlike in size if not appearance. Gemma had named all the abominations back when she'd started working. They loved her for it. Sadie couldn't remember this one's name and felt oddly guilty. "No," she said, putting the skull in her bag. "I just needed a few things." The abomination's face, such as it was, fell. It shuffled closer. "But you're coming back?" Sadie closed the box. "I'm not sure." "Where have you been? We've missed you. It reached out a scarred hand to touch her arm. Sadie pulled firmly out of its grip. You have to move on, she said. There's no one around to give you orders anymore. You're free to do whatever you want. The abomination bobbed its head miserably. Sadie stalked past it into the hallway. There was no one else to hinder her. Flinging the bag onto her shoulder, she turned back. Don't tell them I was here, she said. Leave me alone. Of course, the abomination whispered, eyes downcast. Sadie left. The heavy steel doors to the alchemy lab were coming up again, and this time she could feel their pull. It couldn't hurt to glance inside. She wanted to see what repairs had been made, just to soothe her curiosity. The key probably wouldn't work. It was a new door. If it didn't work, she'd just head back to the castle and... She cursed to herself at the sound of the lock opening. She couldn't suppress the leap of dread in her chest. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Last time she'd been in here, everything had been on fire, and the ceiling had been so destroyed that if it weren't for all the smoke, she would have seen the sky. Now it smelled of paint, and the ceiling was rebuilt. It was no longer the Gothic revival room of before, with 30-foot ceilings and skylights. Instead, the ceilings hung lower, made up of square foam tiles and regular fluorescent lighting. It was probably closer to code now, even if it had lost its charm. It's okay, Sadie thought. I'm not coming back. It doesn't matter. A footstep scraped in the doorway behind her. Sadie glanced back and saw the abomination hovering there. I told you to leave me alone, Sadie snapped. There's, the abomination said. Go on, get it out, said a familiar voice. There's an intruder. Igor stepped inside. She held a gun, which she used to prod the abomination in the back, forcing it farther into the room. What are you doing here? Sadie asked. I'm not late getting back. I was out to fetch our sacrifice, Igor said, looking around. So where is he? Sadie glanced at the abomination, who stared back with wide eyes. The professor? Sadie asked. Of course I mean the professor. He was Dr. Inferno's nemesis. He'll work the best as a sacrifice. Igor focused on Sadie again. Yes, I did a thorough Googling. I knew you worked for him. I hoped, when I saw you coming here, that you'd be coming to meet him. Sadie crossed her arms. I don't work for the professor anymore. Then you won't mind telling me where he went. When Sadie hesitated, Igor prodded the abomination more forcefully. Or I could torture the information out of this thing. It can't tell you anything, Sadie said. It was created to be loyal. It can't be anything else. Igor shrugged. Can it feel pain? Before Sadie had met Gemma, the abomination's pain wouldn't have mattered to her, but Gemma had cared for these things. Her shoulders slumped. Come this way, she said. Igor and the abomination followed her across the lab that no longer echoed majestically with Sadie's footsteps. At the far end of the room, there was another locked door. The nameplate read, Professor Nostradam. Below that were the words, Spare those who surrender. Show no mercy to the rest. Strong words for someone who'd never gotten the hang of the office Keurig. Sadie used her key to open the door. Inside was a small office. This, at least, retained the grandeur of the original building. The windows, hung with ivy, looked out onto the grounds. The heavy wooden desk was neat, with all the papers filed away. On the wall by the door was a coat hook, where a heavy black cloak hung. An empty plague doctor mask dangled from its strap, glassy eyes blank. The professor retired. Sadie said, indicating the cloak. Igor reached out and pulled the mask off the hook, then stared down at it. To where? Sadie shrugged. There was no forwarding address. Do you think he'd come back if he heard his assistant was taken hostage by his enemy? No. Igor smiled. No. I have an inkling about the mentor-mentee relationship. Do you think Dr. Inferno would put himself in danger for you? He'd do everything he could to keep me safe. Igor's eyes focused inward. How do you think he died? Sadie felt an acid heat in her stomach. How? She asked quietly. We were both in the tower, Igor said slowly. The one that was firebombed. The stairwell was destroyed, so we couldn't descend, and the flames were rising. He had one of his machines with him. He told me to hold on to its back while it climbed down the outside of the tower, then send it back for him. She paused, her eyes scanning back and forth, like she was watching the scene again in her head. There was another firebomb before we reached the ground. When the robot came back with Dr. Inferno, he was... She cut herself off and shook her head. He sacrificed himself for me. The acid in Sadie's stomach burned hotter. She looked down at the abomination, which still cowered between them, waiting for them to make a move. Professor Nostradam wouldn't do that for anyone, she said. What about you? Igor nudged the gun into the abomination's head. How noble are you? Enough to give me information to keep this thing from getting hurt. She shifted the barrel to its shoulder, then the middle of its back. Are its organs similar to a human's? I'm not used to working with organic matter. Her finger tightened. Wait, Sadie said. Igor pulled the trigger. The abomination's elbow exploded into blood and bone. It screamed, jerking away from Igor, clutching its destroyed limb. It plowed into Sadie in its frantic escape. She held it against her chest as it struggled, tightening one hand around its upper arm to keep it from spraying blood. Stop it! Sadie shouted at Igor, who tracked the abomination with the barrel of the gun. Sadie pressed her other hand against the abomination's back, like her bare touch could heal it. Not again. Igor lowered the gun. So where's Professor Nostradam? I'll fucking show you, Sadie snarled. Move out of my way. Igor hesitated, then stepped aside. Sadie pushed the abomination ahead of her, supporting its weight as it staggered. Blood splattered to the ground despite Sadie's attempt at a tourniquet. The lab was empty. It would have been so much easier if she'd had the tools at hand, so she pushed on. Halfway across the room, the abomination's legs gave out. Sadie hoisted it up onto her hip like a toddler. Where are we going? Igor asked, right on her heels. Get the door for me, Sadie replied. Whether it was from years of being an assistant or just because she wanted to see where this was going, Igor moved ahead and got the door. Sadie strode into the hallway and headed for the storage closet again. Inside, she let the abomination slide to the floor. She yanked open a drawer of dried herbs, then moved on to the pots of oils. It felt like the room was filling with water, angry magic currents frothing at her ankles and then her knees, the air pressure rising as the room got too small for what it contained. Sadie heard Igor curse when Sadie pulled out the ceremonial knife, but it was distant and Igor didn't make a move to intervene. Sadie thumbed a smear of oil across the slick, bloody flesh of the abomination's arm, then matted a fistful of herbs against it. She sliced the knife across her own forearm, just deep enough to draw blood, and wiped it up with her bare hand. She closed her hand around the abomination's wound. The pressure squeezed down on them, the magic tangibly angry. It was so powerful with rage that Sadie might have choked on it if it wasn't coming from her. The abomination yelped, but its whimpers subsided as Sadie withdrew her hand. The wound knitted itself, torn muscle fibers seeking their other halves, veins sealing together. The flesh went last, zipping together into a neat scar. The atmosphere in the room popped like a bubble. Sadie's ears popped with it. She started to wipe her bloody hand on the leg of her jeans, then thought better of it. She looked up. Igor had the gun leveled two-handed at Sadie, and stared at her with the look of someone who suddenly understood a terrible truth. Sadie had never intended to tell Gemma her true identity. The necromancy department had adopted Professor Nostradam as a mascot, not technically a tenured professor, but enough of a celebrity to qualify for a lab on campus. The fact that the professor was terrifyingly unapproachable and swept through the halls in long robes, an ancient plague doctor mask, and a voice modulator gave campus administrators all the more reason to leave things be. Sadie Jones, by contrast, was a postdoc who served as the professor's spokesperson, and if the two of them were never in the same room at the same time, no one commented on it. There had been a handful of graduate assistants over the years working with Sadie, mostly working to fund their studies, with no real interest in the professor's politics. Gemma was merely the most recent, yet, unlike many others, she wasn't unnerved by the cloud of foul arcane magic surrounding Professor Nostradam. One evening, a year or two into their friendship, Gemma invited Sadie out for drinks, and when the Golden Twins staged an attack on the university 2 hours into their bar crawl, it was hard to pretend that Professor Nostradam wasn't a bit drunk. Gemma connected the dots. The intimacy of another person knowing her secret identity was intense. As Professor Nostradam, she knowingly made decisions that led to innocent deaths, and she was okay with that. But when Gemma knew it was her behind the decisions, it didn't make her a better person, but it made her want to be one, and that was a start. Igor had come to the university with 2 killer robots, which were waiting outside in the parking lot. When Igor, Sadie, and the abomination emerged from the doorway, one strode up to them, its eyes glowing red. "Take that thing back to the castle," Igor told it, pointing at the abomination. "Don't hurt it. Yet." The robot picked up the unresisting abomination and caged it inside its barrel chest, then locked it shut again. It strode off in the direction of the mountain. "If you complete the ritual successfully, I'll let it go," Igor said. "If you don't, I'll mail a piece of it to every professor at the university, along with a note about your identity." She gestured at the other robot. "Take her to the castle." "There are reagents in the trunk of my car," Sadie said. "I need them all if you expect me to do the ritual." Igor held out her hand to Sadie, who tossed her the keys. She popped the trunk open and, wrinkling her nose, hefted out a large, heavy duffel bag. Igor frowned and shut the trunk. "Go," she told the robot. Trying to resist the robot was like trying to arm wrestle a car. It folded Sadie into its chest cavity, which was roughly the size of a refrigerator. When the door slammed shut, Sadie was dropped into pitch blackness. It took an hour to get to the castle. Sadie heard Igor's voice, then felt the sensation of descending in an elevator. When the robot stopped, Sadie knew where they were. The robot opened its chest, and light flooded into Sadie's prison. She squinted, eyes watering. Igor waited outside with a gun. "Out," she said. The abomination was there, held in a robot's firm grip. They all stood in the massive underground chamber beside Dr. Inferno's tank. The duffel bag and the bag of reagents were both on the floor, along with a number of Castle Inferno's supplies. A slip of paper that Igor had filled out had names on it, so Sadie could reference Dr. Inferno's loved ones in the ritual, an important step to calling back his soul. Start setting up, Igor said. Don't even think about sabotaging the spell. If it varies even a little from the resurrection you did for your interview, I'm going to take your abomination and start cutting. Understood, said Sadie. The abomination looked at her, pleadingly. It wasn't begging her to save it. It was begging her to let it die for her. She'd made sure to instill that loyalty in all her abominations, although right now it made her sick. Sadie set about organizing her reagents, setting up a mise en place so she didn't have to scramble during the ritual. The robot that had carried her up the mountain loomed over her, watching. Meanwhile, Igor wheeled a gurney to the tank and set the tank to drain. The fluid level began to drop. Why did you apply for the job, Professor? Igor asked, her back to Sadie. I wanted to know why he disappeared. You didn't think you killed him? My attacks had never killed him before. Sadie shrugged, even though Igor couldn't see it. And once you found out, did you ever intend to do the ritual? Sadie hesitated, measuring the crushed honeysuckle blossoms. I did, she said. Why? Now Igor did turn to look at her. I didn't think it was fair he died where I couldn't see it. Igor smiled bitterly and turned back to the tank. The fluid had finished draining, and Dr. Inferno lay on the bottom of the tank, limp as a jellyfish out of water. Igor unsealed a door to the side and climbed inside to pull him out. Professor, whispered the abomination, just leave me and run. I don't need your loyalty anymore, Sadie said. When you go back to the others, tell them they need to move on. But, shut up, said Igor, hauling the doctor's body onto the gurney. That's enough of that. She carefully tucked a folded towel under his head. Strap him down, Sadie said to Igor. His resurrection could be violent. Sometimes they have seizures. You don't want him falling off the gurney and cracking his head open. Igor didn't look happy, but she buckled the straps across Dr. Inferno's chest and thighs. Sadie chalked the circle on the floor, her mind racing. Once the ritual started, she'd have trouble ending it without a sacrifice. But she had no intention of sacrificing herself for this. Igor, of course, would make the best sacrifice, but how could Sadie get to her? She had no weapon other than the sacrificial dagger. Igor had a gun and 2 killer robots. Igor wheeled the gurney into the middle of the circle. Does this match the setup in the lab upstairs? She asked the robot. Its eyes glowed green. Setup is complete, the robot intoned. Then let's get on with it, Igor said, gesturing for Sadie to get up. Sadie cursed to herself and got to her feet, brushing the chalk off her hands. Fine, Sadie said. Let's begin. A flash of unease went across Igor's face before she recovered her equilibrium and nodded. Sadie could understand that. She'd been mourning Dr. Inferno's death as long as Sadie had been mourning Gemma's. Remember, if this goes wrong, Igor started again. I know, Sadie interrupted. For a supervillain's apprentice, you don't know the first thing about threats. Don't overdo it. Igor glared at her and stepped out of the circle. Go on, then. Sadie began. She'd done this many times. The abominations, of course, all came from a similar process, though they had never been human to start with. She had raised the dead as part of her studies. And then, of course, there had been Gemma. The feeling of rising water was slower, but more powerful this time. Less like filling a bathtub, and more like the swelling of the ocean reaching high tide. She anointed Dr. Inferno's body with the oils. Wisps of smoke began to rise from the runes. Sadie picked up the piece of paper. Igor hugged herself, standing outside the circle, her gun pointed at the floor. She would probably shoot Sadie as soon as the ritual reached the correct part. If only Sadie hadn't shown her the ritual during her interview. Igor knew exactly when the sacrifice should happen. Dr. Obadiah C. Burns, known as Dr. Inferno, Sadie said, son of Cornelius and Gertrude Burns, husband of Catherine Edwards Burns, I call to you. She lit the candle. It flared green as she painted the neck symbols on the body with gritty paste. Igor paced around the circle to get a better view. Sadie tried to keep Igor in her range of vision as she worked. Dr. Obadiah C. Burns, Sadie said. Mentor to Inga Igor Rupertson, nemesis of Sadie Jones, murderer of Gemma Brown. I call to you. She saw Igor's eyes narrow at the last name, but Sadie ignored it as she painted on the next set of runes. The candle hissed and spat. More smoke rose from the circle, and now from the runes on Dr. Inferno's body. Sadie picked up the last bowl of powdered bone and dashed a handful onto his chest. Dr. Obadiah C. Burns, master of this castle, creator of these machines, I call to you with this sacrifice. Sadie flung the rest of the contents of the bowl in Igor's face and dropped to the ground, not waiting to see if they connected. A shot exploded overhead and pinged off a wall. Igor, grabbing her eyes, staggered back. Sadie rolled to her knees and lunged, grabbing Igor's gun hand and forcing it down before Igor could shoot again. She dragged Igor toward the circle, but even with her streaming eyes squeezed shut, Igor fought, digging her feet into the ground. Shoot her! Igor shouted. In the circle! Beside her, Sadie heard the robots moving, a laser powered up. She hauled Igor around, holding her between herself and the robots, and forced her over the chalk line. Tell them to stand down, Sadie said. Fire, said Igor. Both robots fired. The first shot went through Igor's collarbone and into Sadie's chest, punching through her right breast and lung. The second went into Igor's gut and out Sadie's. They dropped to the floor in a wash of blood. The chalk circle blazed as Dr. Inferno's body spasmed. He dragged in a gasping breath. His flesh knit itself together, scarring over. An arm budded in the empty socket. Sadie still had Igor's body, although the woman had gone limp. The fact that the ritual had worked meant Igor was dead. It was the worst pain Sadie had ever felt. She couldn't get enough air, and when she coughed, blood sprayed out of her mouth. Her gut was on fire, and she smelled ruptured bowel. She rolled onto her back. Perhaps this was a fitting end, to be killed in Dr. Inferno's resurrection. At least he'd know the pain of losing his assistant, as she had. The robots stood still, their commands completed. Sadie focused on breathing in and out. The hand on her arm made her flinch, which set off a chain reaction of pain. Sorry, the abomination whispered. It held a fistful of herbs. It peeled her clenched fist open and pressed the herbs into it. Here, do what you did for me. Heal yourself. Sadie let out a loud, angry sob. It hurt so much. I can't, she said. You're not done yet, said the abomination. It took her hand again and began painting the runes on her itself, using her bloody finger as its tool. Sadie let it. Despite the blood spilled everywhere on the floor, the abomination cut its own arm and used that to complete the ritual, pressing its hand on her bleeding chest. The heat flared through her, worse than the wound. She cried out and started choking. She rolled over onto her stomach and coughed out the blood in her rapidly healing lung. In a minute, it was over. Sadie was bathed in blood, her own and Igor's, but she was whole again. The abomination patted her shoulder. The gurney rattled. Dr. Inferno, still strapped in, craned his neck around, trying to see them. Igor, are you? Sadie rose. This time, she didn't hesitate when she wiped her bloody hands on her jeans. Dr. Inferno, she said, and spat a glob of blood on the floor. Who are you? He said, squirming in the restraints. What are you doing in my castle? Is that... He spotted Igor's body and choked off. Sadie limped to her duffel bag. She carried it into the circle, then set it gently down. Glancing around, she checked the chalk circle and the state of her reagents. Plenty left for a second attempt. She unzipped the duffel bag. The corpse inside had mummified over 6 months of storage. Sadie picked up her jar of oils and began to anoint it. Gemma Brown, Sadie said. Mentee of Sadie Jones, victim of Obadiah C. Burns. I call to you.
And welcome back. That was No Mercy to the Rest by Bennett North, and if you enjoyed that, you might also be inclined to check out Escape Pod episode 618, All Profound and Logical Minds. Or, perhaps, the very excellent online magazine they co-edit, Transaluna Traveller's Lounge. And now to ramble on about that story with me, please welcome back your former glorious co-editor, C.L. Clark. Sheree Clark, welcome back to PodCastle.
Good to be back in the castle.
Been a while. Now, normally at this point, I ask editors to introduce themselves for people who might not have been around for your editorial run, but you just narrated this story, so everybody's already heard a bio. So introduce yourself in a way that is non-bio. It's more interesting.
I don't know if it's more interesting, but I know some stuff that's not in my bio and stuff that I picked up. Stuff that I picked up since leaving PodCastle. I now do swords because I have a little extra time now that I'm away from the editing seat. So I started doing sword training. So I train with longsword right now as well as a side sword. It's pretty fun.
You are just living your Gideon the Ninth fantasy, really, aren't you? That's what
absolutely,
it's all about.
Absolutely.
Who can blame you?
Also, we work on the biceps still, so...
So, why did you choose this story to rerun?
Oh, man. So I read it when you invited me to pick a story again, and then I listened to it again just today, and I was still floored just like I had been when I first read it out of the slush pile. It's just, like, it's a sapphic villain who falls in love with someone who makes them want to be a better person. And whether or not they actually get there, they are making the attempts slowly but surely. Even if in the process of loving that person, they become a worse person sometimes. It's just kind of like, that's my thing. Like this love and sacrifice and a really fuzzy morality that, and then obviously I liked it so much that I narrated it. So
it's a very flawed sort of protagonist. That's unveiled across the course of the story, isn't it? Quite how flawed they are. There's often a tendency now to overcorrect with sort of sapphic characters, gay bisexual characters, that we've had too many years of burying the gays, now they all need to be flawless and beyond reproach, and that's just sort of static and stultifying and putting them in a glass coffin. You need to show them flawed still to show the humanity of it, and it's very good at doing that, and that struggle for redemption, isn't it, here?
Yeah, and I mean, we'll leave it to the readers or listeners to feel if they actually did redeem themselves or what happens next, but that's one of my favorite things about this story is that question is ends justifying means. And
how you is sacrificing her arch nemesis effectively at the end, is that justified? Is that okay? Is it what's the morality around killing someone evil to do something good? Because you're still killing that. Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
And are they evil because they had people they loved and they were nice to them?
And they had a chance for redemption and everything. And how could you take that away from them? And
always the question.
Yeah, it's for such a, on the surface, quite a light-hearted sort of, superhero-y pastiche or supervillain pastiche. Surprising sort of depth to the character flaws and the character conflict and everything, isn't it? So it's a good and meaty one. I did enjoy it, and it flows so nicely as well. Just it doesn't feel like it takes as long to read as it does, because it just it barrels along and it pulls you with it. It's good. No, an excellent choice. So, how did you come to be involved with PodCastle first?
Oh, I think it was... So I published my first story with PodCastle, I think in the springish of 2018, I think. And so I was kind of like in the gears, like folks knew about me. I think it was Jen and Kalita at the time who were editing then. And that autumn, I sent in another story, and they were like, cool, but counterpoint, what if we didn't take this story and you became editor instead, because Kalita's leaving and they wanted to make sure that we maintain some amount of diversity on the masthead. And I had just been thinking to myself, like, I knew I wanted to be working in fantasy. Like, I knew that was where I was happiest, where I was strongest. And I had done some editing. I had been a slush reading at the time at Clark's World, which has some fantastic stories, but is predominantly science fiction. And while I enjoy science fiction, and while I enjoyed slush reading at Clark's World, I also knew that I wasn't going to be on the masthead at Clark's World. So I was ready to, like, take the next step, see where I could go. And so that's how I ended up at PodCastle. Started basically January 2019. I don't even know how long I was there, like 2021?
Year and a half, I think. Yeah, I mean, I've been hosting since, the start of last year. Jesus, I'm coming up on 2 years doing this now.
Okay.
I don't know, Eleanor and Shingai have been over. This is about 6 months before I took over from Summer as host. So it must have been about Summer 21, I think you... Yeah.
Or maybe that, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Summer 21, I think you and Jen both sort of stepped down, didn't you? So it was about a year and a half you did. So as rejection letters go, that's a pretty unique one, isn't it?
So it was.
We're going to decline to take your story. We'll just take you.
Not the worst one to get. Worst one to get.
That's a real bittersweet in a way, isn't it? Like, oh, sorry, you've not got the sale. But yeah, what surprised you about editing a podcast then that you didn't expect going in, especially sort of coming in completely from outside rather than having been sort of slusher first, I suppose.
I mean, first it was a lot of work, and I thought that I was just going to be like redlining some stories, and like no, you will be helping to run the magazine. But that was actually, I mean, it makes sense. That was not the biggest surprise or anything, but I had just come out of an MFA few years before that, and like most MFAs, it was very literary based. I was able to write my fantasy stories and even work on my novel, but though I enjoyed some of the people, our styles didn't mesh enough for the opportunities that were available there. Like, there was a magazine that I could have worked on, but I didn't really enjoy the kind of overall taste that was prevalent for that magazine. And so it wasn't fun, I guess. It sounds bad to say, but it just wasn't fun. But when I got to PodCastle, it was like just this giant nerdy family, and I had no idea how fun it would be to just have a bunch of like freaking nerds about genre fiction, who believed in short fiction as genre fiction as well. And it was just, yeah, that was awesome. It was just this big, happy, nerdy family. And even though, like, our tastes diverged very widely, like me and Slush readers, me and Jen, we aligned very well, which is why we worked so well together as co-editors. But we had some, like, really strong differences as well. But we all had the same baseline of being really into fantasy and what it could be in all of its different forms, and that was really pleasant. Yeah.
Coming from the MFA, where it was all literary, a big sort of change. I remember nerding out about. I think it was at Harrow the Ninth. We were sort of secretly exchanging e-arcs of it behind the scenes. Like, oh my god, you need book 2. It's amazing.
Yeah, it was so. Yeah,
I love those books. So, how do you think working here changed you then?
I mean, well, for one, it gave me a lot of time to practice in a way that I didn't quite get working on, like, my MFA's magazine. But I think the stuff I learned the most actually was not the narrative aspect, though. I mean, I got to practice and hone my tastes and stuff, but mostly I just learned how to treat editors and agents, because you get to feel what it's actually like. And at the time, I was just like, well, these losers just don't understand my brilliance. And so I just write them off and whatever.
We all start
there. But now I feel like there is a very strong... there can be a really strong backlash against agents and editors. These folks who come across as gatekeepers, rightly or wrongly. And I think that it taught me the thing that you need most in this industry, which is patience, because you are inevitably, as an editor, going to find something that you absolutely love and for some reason or another cannot take it. Whether it's because your co-editor doesn't jive with it enough, or you literally accidentally just bought something that is just like it and you cannot take it because you don't know when you can put it in the next, like, 6 months. That's not going to feel like a repeat, or something or another. It's not right. Maybe it's just, like, too long and you don't think you can edit, or you don't want to edit it shorter because you think it's perfect as it is.
Just not perfect for where you are editing.
Exactly. Yeah. I one of my favorite things I think about it sometimes as an editor was finding your Cloud story. I found it at Clark's World and I was like, well, I like it, but, you know, it's not for Neil.
It was not. It was never a very Clark's Worldy story. It was a long shot there.
Yeah, but then I found it again, and I was like, it's perfect for me. It's perfect for me right now. And so sometimes you just have to let that kind of serendipity stuff happen. But you can only do that if you're patient as an author.
I mean, I feel like it's gotten even more so over sort of the last 10 years that I've been sort of writer submitting. The odds are stacked against you, and it does need the stars to align. You know, you can be absolutely flawless, but if things just aren't lined up right on that day, that moment, you know, I've had stories rejected because, we really liked it. We just accepted something else just like it. And what can you do? Yeah. And you can just pick yourself up, dust yourself off, write the next thing, can't you? And it isn't personal. You know, editors and agents, everything, I think, like you say, they have this reputation as gatekeepers, but every one of them I've ever met, they're trying to look for reasons to make it work. They want to be the person to find the new story, the new star. They want to be able to champion you and celebrate you. And it's, ultimately we're all working to the same goal. It just doesn't.
And I mean, like, one of my favorite things now is seeing authors that I found as short stories, like they're publishing collections or publishing more stories or novels and stuff. And it's just really awesome to see, to follow careers like that. And
you know, I remember sort of reading like Alex E. Harrow, her roadie stories, where, like, in podcast, Reese's book club now for her for Starling House. I'm like, God, and I adore her stories. I always have. What's the one? The something in the world. I can't remember now. Sort of World War II-ish factory story. I don't
know if I know that one.
The W in the W. And I've got a PodCastle window open quickly. I'm sure I can find it. But Yes, A Whisper in the World, that was it. We ran it back in 2017, and it was Shimmer originally.
Nice.
I love that story. And yeah, now that her novels are just incredible, and getting that recognition. Because she was the first person to win a Hugo under 30 since, was it Ursula K. Le Guin or something?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, anyway, point is, seeing people sort of, when you pick up their first story and see it run and then see where they go is incredible to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
So both your novels are fantasy and the majority of your short fiction, and as you were sort of saying, you've always kind of jived with fantasy a bit more than, not that you don't enjoy science fiction, but just fantasy is more your wheelhouse. Why do you think it captures your imagination more in that way?
I think part of it is because when I was a kid, I tried being into sci-fi and stuff, but none of it was actually like Star Wars, the TV show. And at the time, I didn't really realize that Star Wars had books as well. But the science fiction that people were giving me was like Asimov and Ursula K. Le Guin, and I wasn't ready to study anarchy when I was 8 years old. Now it's very different.
Yeah.
But now there's also space opera, which I know how to find it as an adult. I think the game kind of changed for me. I think in college or thereabouts, the Anne Leckie books came out, and that was my re-entry into sci-fi, and I was like, oh, that's what it can be like. And so then I've been doing a deep dive, and I've been enjoying everything from, Ancillary Justice to The Expanse to, the Ursula K. Le Guin sci-fi stories, The Dispossessed and stuff like that. But at the time, it was always like, I wanted the swords, I wanted the magic, I wanted the swords,
and the sword lesbians,
the creatures. And it took me a while to realize I wanted the sword lesbians as well. But I knew I wanted the ladies with swords.
Yep.
I just didn't know why yet.
Just general sort of aesthetics of fantasy. Then,
yeah.
And so, to be fair, I'm asking you this question. I'm not sure I could necessarily answer because I read and enjoy and watch both, but I don't know. Fantasy's just where my heart is. I don't know why. It's just always clicked more.
I think it's the aspect of the past. I think it's silly to generalize, but maybe sometimes I wonder if people are like past oriented or future oriented. I always enjoyed history a lot, medieval history, like in that kind of European way, but also the broader framework of how we have dealt with things in the past, like. Obviously, in my bio, I talk about being interested in post-colonial history, and I'm interested in how cultures have shifted because of migration, because of trade, all that kind of stuff, and obviously it makes its way into my fiction, but how it gets into like how different authors show that in the fantastic is also, I don't know, it's my jam. Throw in the sword and the like magic flying horse and whatever, and I'm good.
You're a dragon and a wizard with a robe and a sparkly orb, and yeah. I just feel like, I know this is very broad stroke as well and everything, but I always feel like fantasy's more limitless than sci-fi as well, which is daft because they're both just inventing things, but I feel like science fiction often feels like it has to constrain itself to a certain amount of plausibility, whereas fantasy doesn't give two hoots for this is the way the magic works. Why? Because it does, because I like it.
Yep. I want it, I need it, I got it.
Yeah.
Boom.
It's certainly a lot easier to write when you're not having to. I can't write sci-fi without getting caught up in my own logical but how would it work? I'm not going to bloody work out time travel or faster than light travel, but my brain can't let go. It's like, no, but you have to have a reason. Whereas fantasy, I can.
Yeah. One of the main reasons I keep stopping myself every time I'm like, oh, you should write a sci-fi book. It's like, okay, but how does your ship work? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not going to do it. I can't do it.
Yeah, and like, I know it doesn't really matter. You can just go, oh, it's the positronic drive. Why isn't it? Who cares? It's handweight. It's just for the story. But my brain just can't. It has to know. It has to understand. And it's not even like I'm bothered about that when I'm reading it necessarily. But for some reason, when I'm responsible for it, I hold myself to a much higher standard that I can't move past. So yeah, fantasy till I die, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So The Unbroken and The Faithless, your two very excellent novels, are both about colonialism and post-colonialism, but they're also about culture. The power of the Khazari comes from their faith and their ties to their sort of native land. And Princess Luca, for her part, is seeking the power that Balladeer lost when it left its cultural religion behind. So what got you thinking about those topics enough to turn all that symbolism into magic and start writing a whole damn trilogy on them?
So I read a lot of fantasy, like we said, really uncritically as a kid. And by the time I got to college, I started, started taking English literature courses and, learning how to analyze the things I read. But in college, I could actually start applying that to books I wanted to read, not just the stuff that we had to read in high school. And so I was like, well, I'm in this post-colonial English literary theory class. I was in a Francophone African literature class. So all of that literature was about the various nations in Africa being colonized by the French. It was all written by authors who were native to those lands, but obviously they were writing in French. And then I was also in a independent study where I could actually focus on things I wanted. And so I was looking at fantasy novels where women were, or fantasy media in general, where women were able to be violent. So I got to kind of look at all of them again through this lens of just a bit more of a critical lens. And I was thinking, well, basically all of fantasy is some kind of colonial fantasy. Like, okay, the great king is going to go to war against that nation. Why? Well, they have this thing that he wants. Or the great explorers are going to go and steal this thing from so-and-so because it has a magical power that they need. And in the end of the day, it was always some sort of resource grab, which is what colonialism ultimately was. And so I started thinking that I would like to look at it more I would like to write a book where that was focused on more deliberately, not as a incidental aspect, like an incidental trope of fantasy. And so part of that was figuring out what cultural capital each country was coming with and why the colonialism was happening. And so in this case, it was magic. And I was also inspired a bit by, I use this pitch in my, when I was doing pitch wars and things, or Twitter pitch wars. And it was like Django Wexler's The Thousand Names, except the points of view were switched. And instead of the colonizers stealing the magic was fighting back with the people. And that was what I really wanted to explore. And so having the magic tied integrally to the cultures and what kinds of things you lose as a colonizer and what kinds of things you might have to hide or protect while you are being colonized if you want it to stay yours, as well as how much of it is memory that gets erased. And so in that case, a lot of the Khazali, they don't know their magic, or they don't have enough faith to practice it because it is a religiously based magic system. And similarly, because the Balladeerans have banned religion and want to ban it for other people, they have also lost this link to whatever cultural power they had. And I think that was definitely important for me to explore. There's also the aspects that are more mundane but very real aspects of colonization, which are language loss, story loss, generations of dead. I mean, we can see that right now, playing out this week. So
yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. What else? I was thinking. Oh yeah, so it's not just erasure, but also the replacement of what the colonizer wants you to think. There's the aspect of brainwashing. So we've got Terrain and all of the other conscripts who are forcibly re-educated in Balladeer. So they come back having none of this culture, and so they're estranged from from both sides. But then we also have the generation that's right under Terrain and the conscripts. And though they were, most of them, raised in their native home, they were not raised with the potential for education because everyone was very silenced. And so it's a very interesting mix, I think. And I really wanted to just explore how colonization impacts various generations on both sides. Because we've got Luca and also we have General Cantic, who was of the colonizing generation. And Luca, like, she's bad, but she was too young to be an active participant. She's just enjoying the spoils, basically. But yeah. Very long answer for that question.
No,
and I could be longer, but I could be shorter.
I could listen to it all day. We ran a story recently, very recently actually, in the last couple of weeks, that was about the Welsh language. And yeah, I mean, the Welsh were colonised by the English, and we tried to drive their language out of them. You know, literally used to beat kids for speaking in their native language. You know, it's all very real. You know, this is how empires work, is they try and reframe your way of thinking and try and break your connection to your past, because, you know, when you've got that connection to your past, you start to think, well, why are you here then? You know, we were all right without you before. Why do we need you now?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really, that's something I've been thinking about a lot this week, as like, obviously I'm talking about the Israel and Palestine war. I don't know why we're calling it that. Genocide. And yes. I keep thinking about just like the way nobody knows how things started, like how that kind of history gets erased continually by people in power, and how Luca has to work so hard to find her own history, even, and how things happened in Balladeer, like the erasure of their religion, which was done by one of her ancestors. And even though it's her country, she's still having to find a hard time, which is I wonder how many Brits know that, how many know about the Balfour Treaty, like
how many know about the famines in India in the 40s, you know? You know, Churchill gets held up as this paragon of virtue, and he was a massive racist, you know. I mean, the British Empire, when they were leaving some of their former colonies, were literally throwing briefcases full of, you know, notes and documents overboard to erase the history of what they had done there. So, you know, we hide that today. Well, quite Windrush. What? Sorry.
What?
I mean, and God knows what they're going to do with the hostile environment they have now, and trying to ship people out to Rwanda when they're just trying to claim asylum and everything. Yeah. And yeah, you know, we deliberately tried to hide our own history. And then, I mean, I'm a product of the British education system. Did I get anything about the British Empire except, well, but it gave the steam engine, the trains to everybody? Yeah, did we ever mention what we took from them in exchange? And people in this country have got a really very one-sided view of the British Empire and think that it was just this grand, benevolent thing. Oh, well, you know, we ended slavery. Yeah, who was the biggest beneficiary of the bloody thing? You know, who made the most out of it? Well, they could. You know, it's, you know, just because I feel really bad for having just stabbed you repeatedly 30 times. I'm going to be the person who puts the knife down now. That doesn't get you merit. You know, and
all those families are still in power.
It's still very rich from it, and still very much benefiting from everything they stole from the world around them. And it's just not known in this country. And people, and I think a lot of the problems we have politically as a country now, Brexit and the like, is that we've got such a one-sided view of our own history, and we don't actually understand our history and our place in the world now because we haven't got the context. You know, people voted for Brexit thinking we'd be back to glorious Britain, rule Britannia, you know, Victorian Empire. You think we're a very different world now, and at this point we're now just a small tired island as opposed to what we were relative to the rest of the world 150 years ago. You know, it's a different place, but people can't recognise that and acknowledge that because we're not taught it right. We're given such a skewed view of the history. So completely.
And I mean, the US is no different. The US is no different. You have to be interested, you have to be curious, which is actually, I mean, that kind of brings us full circle. That's why I am so adamant about including these kinds of contexts, these nuanced explorations in fiction, because not everybody, many people are reading fantasy.
Yes.
And some people are willing to think a little harder for it. And so these stories are for those folks.
Yeah. And like I say, you were trying to deliberately and consciously think about the colonialism inherent. And I think in other fantasy, it's not even, it was just subconscious. It was just automatic because it's the inherited culture, especially because so much of fantasy was grounded in that medieval Europe milieu. Mm-hmm. It inherited that sort of colonialism from the time, and it's just taken for granted, not even challenged, not even contemplated, is it? And
that's also why I wanted to explore, like I wanted originally Terrain and Luca were just going to be like, oh, they're going to be like a bodyguard royal trope. And then I was like, oh, but we're like, if she's a conscript, that relationship dynamic is very different. So how do we get there and what can we do with it? So that was really fun.
I always think a story is best illuminated when it's told from the perspective of the outsider. So I remember noticing that China Mieville did it like in his stories. It's always someone on the fringes of society, the protagonist in his stories. And it feels very much like that here with Terrain. She's very on the edges of both. Like you say, she's an outsider in her own culture, and was always and forever going to be an outsider in Baladare, no matter what she thought. And it's an interesting way of really illuminating the relationship between the two cultures by doing it from the position of someone who is bridging the gap, but not really. Bridging suggests a connection. It's someone who's fallen in the cracks between them, really, isn't it?
That's a much better way of putting it. I'm stealing that for my next talk.
You've spoken before. They both rattle along with twists and turns. It's amazing how quickly the Unbroken gets going from. I think it's like page 3. There's the hanging in the market square, and that's the inciting incident, and it all just unspools from there. So they rattle along at a hell of a pace. And you've spoken before about how you use the story engine deck to sort of help draft. How much do you sort of rely on that? How do you use that to kind of steer the whole thing almost and just brainstorm from scratch, or is that just when you kind of get stuck and you already know broadly where you're going?
So the story engine actually, it came later in my process. Like I didn't actually have that until I was in the middle of book 2, and the story engine it's kind of tricky because there are ways to incorporate it in the middle of a story, but what I find when I'm actually using it is that it can help me think of a new scene or something like that if I realize I have a gap. But what I actually find is that I'm pulling out motivations and stuff, and I'm like, oh, well, this doesn't really work, or something like that. And it helps me find what actual motivations are already on the page, which I find is actually what helps the most when I have writer's block anyway, is seeing what's actually on the page and then working from there to find the next cause and effect and so on. But the way I do use it is it can also be helpful just to just like fill in holes of something. Like I need a cooler place to set this thing that needs to happen. So in book 2, in The Faithless, there is a scene that happens when Terrain and Luca and Terrain's little protege go on a little adventure to a different county, I guess. Is
it when they get to the farm and the vineyard and all that, isn't it?
Yes. Yep. So there's the big mountain tour thing, like the big hill, and there's a story engine card that is basically this tour, and I was like, oh, that sounds good. And then I just started building things around it. The next project, the next novel that I'm working on, it started as a story engine, like from the very, very beginning. And then later I got some cards from the deck of worlds, and so I actually built out some of the areas. I might even use the next lore deck when the time comes, and I'm not as active on it right now because of other stuff, but it came from Story Engine, and I wrote a proposal based on it and sold it, and so it's coming for you guys. It's coming, but
very cool.
That'll be my first full Story Engine novel.
Very cool. We're getting close to the end now, so I will ask the most important question that everything's been building up to. Did your arms inspire Terrain's, or did Terrain's arms inspire yours? For people who haven't seen the book cover, I should say go and quickly Google the Unbroken book cover and see Terrain's arms on the cover. That led to a great deal of thirsting on Twitter at the time.
So, realistically, and most honestly, I will say that my arms came first. However, at the time of writing, or at the time of publication, I think Terrain's arms were probably better. But now, I think mine are better again. You
got the two-handed sword for conditioning.
Yeah, I got the two-handed sword. I've been working on them again, very explicitly. But most importantly, like I just wanted somebody who looked like me in a fantasy, and I put a butch black lesbian, or like just like a butch lesbian of color at all, was just something that I wanted, and boom.
Clearly, it worked for the internet.
Yeah.
As did the cover of book 2, in fact, for different reasons.
I've seen a sketch for the cover of book 3. No one is ready. No one is ready.
Is this even thirstier? Book 3, thirsty like you've never known.
It depends on your definition.
And on the definition on the muscles and the cover?
Oh, the definition on the muscles is excellent.
What are you working on now that we can look forward to then? I get that's a clue to book 3 being imminent, I suppose. I mean, we always knew it was a trilogy.
Yes.
When's it due?
I believe it is probably going to come out around the same time as the others, March-ish 2025.
Okay.
Because I've got some other stuff in the pipelines that will be coming out. Hard to say exactly when, but I've got a secret novel. I've got a couple novellas from Tor.com, one of which I am actively finishing some revisions on. So late 2024, early 2025. But I'm very busy. Just probably you're not going to see anything from me until the end of 2024 at the earliest.
Publishing lag is very real and very frustrating, isn't it? Finally then, I mean, I'd say what works would you recommend people read? I think the 2 novels are probably a very good starting place. Where can people find out more about you and about The Unbroken and the Faithless, which everybody here listening should read because they're bloody marvellous?
At the moment, obviously, I am still on the dying site that is Twitter, and you can still find me at C_L_CLARK. But if you want something that is going to last a bit longer, you can find me.
It's 2 weeks until this interview airs. Who knows?
Well, exactly. I really don't. I have no idea. So if you want to find me, where I will definitely be, because I just paid my website bill like last week, it is clclarkwrites.com. So CLCLARKWRITES.com.
Marvellous. We've got about 20 seconds left before this kicks us off, so I'm very quickly going to say, Sheree, thank you very much for coming back. It's been a fascinating conversation.
So good to be back.
That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, your co-editors Shingai Enjiro Kagunda and Eleanor R. Wood, assistant editor Caitlin Zavanovich, audio engineers Devin Martin and Eric Valdez, and our many wonderful first readers, Andrew Cahoe, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Corsini, Ryan Cole, Sarah S. Messenger, Sophie Barker, Shrikripa Krishna Prasad, Tava Nova, Tierney Bailey, Zeev Witties, and myself, Matt Dovey. Thank you for letting us share another story with you. The legal bit. PodCastle is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 international license. That means you can share it, and please do, but you cannot sell it and you cannot change it. If you want specifics, check creativecommons.org. Our music is by Shiva in Exile. Everything we do on PodCastle is 100% donor funded, and if you'd like to support what we and the rest of EA do, please join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/EApodcasts. Prefer another method? There's details for supporting us via Twitch, Amazon Prime, Ko-fi and PayPal on escapeartist.net. We'll be back next Tuesday with another fantastic tale. In the meantime, you might care to check out our sister podcasts: Escape Pod for science fiction, Pseudopod for horror, Cast of Wonders for YA speculative fiction, and Catscast for speculative cat stories. If your heart belongs to us though, we'll see you next week. Be safe and be kind.